Don't skip out on our family gathering. Who cares about your parents' funeral? Just get here now. I couldn't believe my ears when I received this call during my mother's funeral. A family gathering? Skipping out? Where in the world would you find a daughter-in-law who would leave her own parents' funeral to attend her husband's family gathering? First off, it was strange that Ken was even present at this moment. I was painfully aware of how frivolous Ken was, and it made my blood boil. Understood. I replied, calming my heart and answering coolly. Fortunately, the ceremony was almost over. Mom, just wait a bit, okay? Ideally, I wouldn't want to leave my mother's side for a moment, but I couldn't stand letting Ken have his way any longer. When my mother's funeral ended and we took a lunch break with the relatives, I approached my father. Dad, I'm going to step out to Ken's place for a bit. I'll be back soon, so don't worry. After telling my father, he seemed to understand something and nodded, okay. Clenching my fists, I rushed out of the funeral home in my mourning attire. My name is Charlie Turner. I'm 30 years old and work at a call center. I recently started dating a man I've been with for half a year. His name is Ken Norman. He's 5 years older than me and works as a civil servant at the city hall. Ken has a kind face with droopy eyes, and his job as a public officer suits him well. Ken commutes to his job at the city hall from his parents' home. His family's home is in a rural area, far from the urban center, and he commutes by car. We met in Ken's hometown when I was there for my photography hobby. It's a region I seldom visit, so when it got dark, I found myself lost on a dark rural road. Is everything okay? That was Ken, approaching in his car. Surprised, I honestly explained that I was lost due to my unfamiliarity with the area. Ken's kind face immediately made me feel he was a good person. The nearest station is quite far from here. Shall I drive you? But... Initially, I was hesitant to get into a car with a man I just met, but Ken showed me his civil servant ID from his wallet. This is who I am. However, if you're scared to get in the car, feel free to decline. He said, considerately letting me make the decision. After a brief hesitation, considering it would take over 30 minutes to walk to the station. And it was already getting dark, I didn't feel up to walking there alone. Then, I'll take you up on your offer. And so, I got into Ken's car. Ken was just as gentle and calm as he appeared at first. After safely dropping me off at the station, he timidly asked for my contact information. Normally, I wouldn't just give out my contact details to any man, but seeing Ken's character, I felt it was all right to exchange numbers with him. After that, Ken and I started going out on a few dates, and 3 months later, we began a relationship following his proposal. Our relationship seemed smooth even after we started dating. Maybe because Ken had a stable job as a civil servant, he always seemed to have a certain ease about him. Being 5 years older, his composed demeanor provided me with a sense of security. Even I, not the best at romance, thought that if I could have a peaceful love life with Ken, that would be all I could ask for. Just when we were about to celebrate half a year together, Ken proposed to me out of the blue. If I'm going to marry, you're the only one I can think of. If you accept, you'll have to come over to my parents' place, is that okay with you? He said in his usual gentle tone. Ken's dad is a farmer, so on his days off, it seems there's a need to help out with the farming. That's why he wanted to live near his parents' house even after marriage. I hesitated a bit. Because my mother was sick, and the doctors said she might not have long. Her hospital is in the town where I currently live, so moving to Ken's family's place would mean I can't visit her as easily as before. But I also had a strong desire to give my mother the good news of my marriage to ease her worries. She's always been concerned about my future, especially since I turned 30, so I thought marrying Ken would be the best way to reassure her. After some thought, since I had no objections to marrying Ken, I replied, yes, I'd love to. At that moment, I was so happy about marrying Ken that I figured even if we lived near his family's home, I could make time to visit my mother. Looking back, that decision was a big mistake, but swept up in the excitement of the proposal, I was completely blind to it. Once we decided to get married, I introduced Ken to my parents during one of my mom's good days at the hospital. Ken brought his parents too, and we all met there. Ken is finally getting married. I was so eager to meet the kind of lady he'd bring home. It's good that she's a capable girl, since this boy can't do much on his own. Oh, Mom, stop it. You're embarrassing me. His mother, seemingly eager about our marriage, chatted away happily throughout the meeting. She was quite talkative, and my parents mostly just nodded along. Ken's father, on the other hand, was the quiet type, making the meeting mostly dominated by Ken's mother. Every so often, Ken would interject, and I could tell they had a close parent-child relationship. "Well, Charlie, you'll have to work hard for us," his mother said in a clingy tone at the end, leaving me feeling a bit uneasy. Work hard. I wondered what exactly she expected of me, but didn't pursue the matter further, and the meeting concluded. So, I moved in with Ken, as planned, near his family's house. Our apartment was a small one, just a 10-minute walk from his parents' place. I didn't want to live with them, so I was relieved it was just the two of us. On our first day in the apartment, the doorbell rang. Thinking it might be some solicitor, I opened the door, only to find Ken's mother standing there. "Oh, Charlie, I was just wondering what your new home looks like. Do you mind if I take a look around?" Sure," I said, caught off guard as Ken hadn't mentioned his mother's visit. But he seemed to know she was coming and welcomed her in. "Well, it's a bit cramped, but a pretty nice house. Since you'll be doing the housework, make sure to keep the kitchen and bathroom clean. It gets dirty quickly. I hear young people these days don't open windows much, but you need to ventilate regularly. Mold could grow and affect Ken's health. Also, come help out with the farming on weekends. Ken will be tired from work, so you'll need to pitch in. And don't make the food too salty, we don't want Ken getting high blood pressure." His mother rattled off. Although she spoke in a gentle tone, there was an undeniable pressure that left no room for my input. I never expected my mother-in-law to butt in about our household matters, so naturally, I was surprised. Moreover, everything she said revolved around Ken, like Ken is tired or it might affect Ken's health. I appreciate a parent's love for their child, but I wondered if it was appropriate for her to say such things to a daughter-in-law who had just joined the family. I questioned her. "With all due respect, ma'am. I also work at a call center during the day. So, I get home around the same time as Ken and would like to share household duties with him. Of course, I'll do what I can, but as a couple, we will make our own decisions." I didn't know the extent of my mother-in-law's fearsomeness at the time, so I was able to confidently express my opinion. After hearing my rebuttal, she froze for a moment, then her expression slowly turned to one of anger. "What are you saying? Is a call center job busier than a public officer's job? I don't think so. Don't act like you're on the same level as our Ken when you don't have a significant job. Besides, traditionally, women do the household chores. That's what marriage is about, right?" I was shocked. My mother-in-law's insistence on imposing her old-fashioned values and defending Ken made me feel sick to my stomach. I looked at Ken, hoping for his support. He opened his mouth with an uncomfortable look. Now, Mom, let's leave it at that. Charlie didn't mean any harm, right?" "Yes, but..." I reluctantly nodded, and my mother-in-law huffed, "Well, that's enough," and left our house. I had hoped Ken would stand up to his mother more clearly, and I felt a bit disappointed that he only defended me vaguely. After she left, I asked Ken, "Is your mom always like that?" Pushing old-fashioned values on us really surprised me. As I sighed, Ken looked puzzled. "Old-fashioned values? I actually agree with Mom. I want you to mainly handle the household chores. I'll help with the farming, but I work in a physically demanding job as a public officer, so I'd like to rest on the weekends. You agreed to this when we got married, so that's okay, right? And please don't speak ill of my mom. It hurts me." I was speechless at Ken's stance. What does he mean? I knew we were going to live near his family's house, but I never agreed to take on all the household chores. The farming was supposed to be just occasional help. But now, this was the reality. His mother must adore Ken. And he clearly loves her too. At 35, Ken was a classic mama's boy. Since then, I've grown weary of Ken and his mother's various actions. She would come over for no reason, saying things like, "Ken's tired today, so make his favorite beef stew," or, "Next weekend, Ken wants to go on a trip, so we're going. You take care of the house and the farm. Don't you dare slack off." I wondered why Ken hardly ever communicated with me, but always told his mother things like how tired he was or that he wanted to go on trips. It felt like she was the wife, and I was just a housekeeper. My frustrations piled up, and I deeply regretted marrying Ken. The weekend they went on their trip, after visiting my mom. I went to help my father-in-law with his farming. It felt odd to be the only one helping out at my in-laws' farm while they were off having fun, but I didn't want to give my mother-in-law another reason to complain. Truth be told, I did want to help my father-in-law because he's a good man. I can't believe those two. Going on a trip and leaving all the work to Charlie. What are they thinking? I'm really sorry about this, he said, clearly frustrated with Ken and his wife's selfishness. He apologized to me from the bottom of his heart. No, it's okay. I like helping you out. How's your mom doing? It doesn't seem like her condition is getting any better. Maybe soon. I didn't want to finish that sentence and looked down. Charlie. He looked at me intently, as if he wanted to say something, but hesitated whether now was the right time. Is something wrong? I knew he's not much of a talker and might be struggling with how to start. I encouraged him to speak. Actually, there's something I need to tell you. He finally began, opening up after much effort. That's the situation. After hearing his story, I was speechless. That can't be true, can it? Yes, it's definitely true. I don't know how to apologize, considering you've just gotten married. He looked genuinely sorry, shrinking and bowing his head. I reassured him it wasn't his fault and said, please, don't apologize, while still struggling to comprehend the facts he had just shared. What should I do now? If his story was true, I needed to think about my next steps. I gazed at him, deep in thought. I want you to do whatever you think is best. I'll support you fully in that. Okay, thank you. I responded, but his words stayed in my mind all night long after I returned home. What should I do? How should I act when Ken and his mother returned from their trip? These thoughts consumed me. A month later, my mother passed away. The doctor had warned us she didn't have long, so while it wasn't a surprise, it was still the most shocking event of my life for me and my dad, who had hoped she would live longer. Ken, my mom's funeral is tomorrow. I told him with a heavy heart. He simply replied, understood. Ken had been coming home late recently, maybe because he was busy. Then, his mother showed up at our house again. I thought she came to offer condolences, but instead, she looked at me and sneered, what's with that puffy face? It's embarrassing to look like that even if your mom died. My face was swollen from crying over my mom's death. Yet, instead of offering sympathy, she came to criticize me. It seemed incredibly insensitive. And there was a hint of pleasure on her face. I felt a surge of anger towards her, but I just didn't have the energy to confront her at that moment. The next day, a Saturday, we held my mom's funeral near my parents' home. I left earlier than Ken to meet with my dad and arrange the funeral. My father, being the chief mourner, was busy with various tasks. I stood by his side, helping him. Gradually, other relatives began to arrive, nodding their heads in respect towards my dad and me. They all seemed unable to hide their sorrow over my mother's premature passing. I noticed that Ken and his mother were conspicuously absent, even though my father-in-law had already arrived and was seated. Ken did mention that he might take a bit longer to get ready, but could he still be preparing even now? When I exchanged glances with my father-in-law, he too seemed puzzled. As the funeral for my mother began, Ken and his mother were still nowhere to be seen. During the ceremony, I felt my smartphone vibrating in my pocket from an incoming call. I initially ignored it, but the calls kept coming. Seizing an appropriate moment, I excused myself and stepped outside the funeral home to check who was calling. It was Ken. Worried that something might have happened to them on the way to the funeral home, I answered the phone. Hello, Ken? Where are you? I asked in a subdued voice. But instead of answering my question, Ken abruptly said, Don't skip out on our family gathering. Who cares about your parents' funeral? Just get here now. I couldn't believe my ears. This was a call during my own mother's funeral, in a tone and with words I had never heard from the usually calm Ken. I was so shocked that I momentarily pulled the phone away from my ear. A family gathering? Skipping out? Where in the world would you find a daughter-in-law who would leave her own parents' funeral to attend her husband's family gathering? Moreover, it was odd that Ken wasn't here right now. I was painfully aware of how frivolous Ken was, and it made my blood boil. Understood. I replied, calming my heart and answering coolly. Fortunately, the ceremony was almost over. Mom, just wait a bit, okay? Ideally, I wouldn't want to leave my mother's side even for a moment, but I couldn't stand letting Ken have his way any longer. When my mother's funeral ended and we took a lunch break with the relatives, I approached my father. "Dad, I'm going to step out to Ken's place for a bit. I'll be back soon, so don't worry." After telling my father, he seemed to understand something and nodded, "Okay." Clenching my fists, I rushed out of the funeral home in my mourning attire. My father-in-law and I headed together to the venue where Ken's mother's relatives were gathering. Hearing me talk to Ken on the phone, my father-in-law probably thought he had something to say to them as well. The venue, I learned from Ken, was his aunt's house. As we rang the doorbell and Ken commanded us to enter, I was startled but exchanged glances with my father-in-law and stepped into the presence of Ken and his mother. "I'm terribly sorry for being late." Ken's relatives on his mother's side looked surprised as they saw me and my father-in-law. "Charlie, why are you in mourning clothes? It's just a family gathering, you should have dressed more casually." Ken, now speaking in a rough tone, was taken aback by my attire. It was not surprisingly. Ken and his mother probably never expected my father-in-law and me to show up in our mourning clothes without changing. "Oh, sorry about that." We were suddenly informed and didn't have time to change. "Today is my mother's funeral, and you were preparing to attend this morning, weren't you?" "We never thought there would be such a gathering," I said in a calm tone, and the relatives exchanged confused glances. "Your mother's funeral? Why didn't Ken and his mom attend?" It seemed that Ken's mother's relatives were unaware that my mother had passed away and that we were in the midst of her funeral. Ken and his mother looked uncomfortably at each other. These two had skipped my mother's funeral without telling anyone and were enjoying this insignificant family gathering as if nothing happened. Even thinking about it calmly made me furious. "Hey, Charlie. Your mother passed away? Why didn't you tell us?" If we had known, we would have certainly attended the funeral. Ken's mother tried to act as if she knew nothing about it. But her lies were useless. I took out my smartphone and showed everyone the message in our family group chat. "Well, you must have known. Look, I sent the message right here. My mother passed away. See, it's been read by all three of you. You saw this message, didn't you?" I held my smartphone screen right in front of her face, as if to present irrefutable evidence. The relatives stared at Ken and his mother with a heavy gaze. Cornered with no escape, Ken's mother trembled. She seemed to have incited anger. "Silence. You're making these sly moves, trying to complain to me. Do you enjoy bullying your mother-in-law? After all, I allowed you to marry my precious Ken, and you're being impudent." Ken's mother finally showed her true colors, screaming as if I was the one at fault. But the relatives, having heard her outburst, were clearly appalled. It was obvious who the villain was between me and her. "I'll return those words right back to you. For you and Ken to skip my mother's funeral and waste time here, it seems you have no human heart," I said, probably with flames of anger in my eyes. Ken, not used to seeing me express my emotions, widened his eyes in surprise. "Oh, don't make it sound so bad. We were just carried away. I mean, it's not like we normally do this. We thought there might be some important discussion since it's a gathering of Mom's relatives." Now it was Ken's turn to make a desperate excuse. "Even if there was an important discussion, is there something more important than your wife's mother's funeral? Even if there was, wouldn't it be mannerly to at least inform beforehand?" I was on the verge of exploding with irritation at Ken and his mother's unapologetic attitude. "The phone battery died, okay? I tried to contact you." Ken's excuses piled up, sounding more like a child's reasoning, giving me a headache. Realizing that accusing Ken and his mother like this would lead nowhere, I pondered my next move. Just then, my father-in-law stepped forward and spoke up. "I've been listening to this whole conversation, and what you two are saying is absurd. It's disrespectful to Charlie's mother. Apologize," he said in a stern tone. But Ken and his mother didn't budge even after hearing his words. My father-in-law sighed deeply, as if this was his final warning, and opened the voice recorder on his phone. "If you don't apologize, I'm going to play this right now." Ken and his mother exchanged puzzled looks. Knowing what was about to be played, I swallowed nervously. "Charlie's mother, she doesn't have much time left, does she?" "Yeah, Charlie said she's quite weak. I sometimes visit her, but she's really thinned down and always connected to tubes." "Oh dear, then it's almost time, isn't it?" I can't wait to get a hefty inheritance and insurance money. Make sure you take care of me. Of course, Mom. I'd do anything for you. This unbelievable conversation between Ken and his mother about my mother's condition was what came through the voice recorder. The conversation continued. But to get all the inheritance and insurance money, Charlie and her dad would be in the way, right? The beneficiary of the mother's estate and insurance is Charlie and her dad, isn't it? Even though Charlie's share would be Ken's as they're married, that means only half of the inheritance would be ours. Yeah, that's true. What are you planning, Mom? Hee, isn't it obvious? If those two were gone, right? Mom, you're really scary. They laughed as if it was a joke, but to me, it sounded anything but funny. The relatives' eyes widened in shock as they stared at Ken and his mother. A month ago, when I visited my in-laws, my father-in-law had told me about this. He overheard Ken and his mother having this dangerous conversation in the living room late at night. He hurriedly recorded it on his voice recorder, thinking it would be evidence if something happened. I was trembling, knowing that Ken had betrayed me and was conspiring with his mother to get my mother's money. Ken, who I thought was kind and the perfect marriage partner, was plotting something like this. Since that day, I've been filled with doubts about Ken. Hearing the recording, Ken and his mother started to tremble. They realized they had no escape. What is this? Nonsense. Don't play tricks on me. Ken's mother shouted, but no one believed her words anymore. While a video might be fabricated, it's impossible for my father-in-law or me to fake voices on a voice recorder so realistically. Ken slumped in resignation. After playing the recording, my father-in-law, red-faced with anger, said, "After hearing this conversation and Charlie's testimony, it's clear that you and your mother are despicable. Not only did you not attend Charlie's mother's funeral, but you also planned to harm Charlie and her dad to steal the money. Apologize to Charlie right now." Usually reserved, my father-in-law was fuming, causing Ken and his mother to tremble in fear. "Sorry. Please forgive me. I just wanted to live happily with my mom. I just loved Ken too much and made a wrong judgment." They both excused themselves, but my father-in-law seemed to have lost all patience. "What? You two clearly have no remorse. I'm divorcing your mother. I'm embarrassed to be part of a family with such senseless people. What about you, Charlie?" The word divorce from my father-in-law's mouth shocked Ken and his mother. "Yes, of course, I want a divorce too. I'll be expecting a proper alimony payment." "Thank you," I said so respectfully and nodded firmly at my father-in-law. We had both intended to divorce Ken and his mother from the start. I had been waiting for the right moment, and today, I finally got a good enough reason to bring up divorce. "Divorce? What do you mean?" While Ken was shocked, Ken's mother, facing a late-life divorce, trembled at the thought. "How am I supposed to live now? I've been a housewife since marrying you." She pleaded with my father-in-law, but he coldly dismissed her. "That's not my problem. Let your dear Ken take care of you." She was utterly defeated. "Are we really getting divorced? I was just brainwashed by Mom. I love you, Charlie. Without me, you'd struggle to live, right?" So, Ken, misunderstanding the situation, thought I couldn't live without him. I glared at Ken and said, "Sorry, but I can live just fine on my own without you. I was living a normal life before we got married. Don't flatter yourself thinking that I can't live without you. And by the way, I'll be taking a hefty alimony from you." After my final words, Ken slumped to the ground in defeat. I exchanged a glance with my father-in-law and said, "Well then," before leaving Ken's aunt's house and returning to my mother's funeral home. A few days later, I successfully divorced Ken, as I had declared. It was a marriage that didn't even last a year. Ken, probably concerned about what others would think, begged me, "Just a little longer, at least let's not divorce for another year." Realizing he wasn't asking out of love, but merely for appearances, I flatly refused his request. Ken, who had been so bold on the day of my mother's funeral, seemed to have reverted to his meek self. It was as if he had a split personality. I realized I had been deceived by him in many ways. And of course, I got a good amount of alimony from him. The divorce hit Ken hard. He lost his motivation for work and took several months off. My father-in-law and Ken's mother are in the middle of divorce proceedings, and with her being mentally unstable, Ken couldn't even rely on his beloved mother and was holed up at home alone. Plus, in a small rural area, Ken and his mother's actions had spread everywhere. They became pariahs in their own community, eventually forced to move away to an unfamiliar land. Ken's mother is now living with him, but I wonder how they will manage to survive together. If only Ken had truly seen me and cared for my mother, our marriage could have continued happily. It's all self-inflicted. Ken might end up quitting his job if he doesn't recover his willpower. He should just try his best to continue his lonely bachelor life. I've sworn never to fall for a man like Ken again, who is only kind on the surface and puts his mother first. I've moved back to a lively urban area near my workplace, back into an apartment. This place is the most comforting, I thought. It suits me better than an unknown rural area. I still occasionally contact my former father-in-law to discuss the progress of their divorce. It seems their divorce will be finalized soon, and I plan to visit him once it's done. He's no longer my father-in-law, but we share the same pain. I think we can have a good relationship moving forward. Living in a place where Ken isn't, I enjoy every day, living in a way that would make my late mother proud.